The Trump administration has announced a sharp refocus of its Africa strategy to counter what it's described as predatory practices of China and Russia. National Security Advisor John Bolton laid out the new strategy during an address at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. He says the U.S. will now choose its African partners more carefully. Critics are skeptical because it has taken nearly 2 years into Trump's presidency to announce the Africa strategy, and the president is well known for his disparaging remarks about the continent that is home to 1.2 billion people. All right, for more on this, we are joined by Jessica Stone in Washington. Jessica, thank you for joining us. Now, the U.S. policy on Africa is yet to be solidly defined months into Trump's presidency. What are the highlights from the briefing for the National Security Advisor John Bolton can you share with us?
Well, we can share with you that many of the things you just discussed are accurate from his speech, but you know, he really laid out 3 or 4 different things that this strategy is designed to do. And keep in mind, it does not have a great level of detail other than broad brushstrokes, themes, if you will. But he did lay out those 4 themes, and they are countering the influence of China and Russia within the continent of Africa, combating radical Islamic terrorism, using economic development like trade, not aid, to help the people of Africa improve their stations in life, and reevaluating the U.S. UN peacekeeping commitment, in particular with reports of abusive nature from some UN troops. There's also an idea that these need to be better targeted and that the spending on them should not just simply roll over. So those were some of the things he discussed. Now, interestingly enough, there was a lot of the ambassadors and deputy chiefs of station here from various African countries, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Kenya, all sitting in the front row. And I had a chance to speak to some of them after the speech, and they came away with a couple of takeaways. Number one, very light on specifics. They're still looking for more detail on what type of resources are going to be put on the table. And number two, they said, look, you know, it sort of seems like Washington just woke up to the fact that Beijing has been engaging with us for a long time and working with us to develop our economies and our infrastructure. And in many ways, John Bolton legitimated that perspective in saying that China and Russia and their focus on the continent of Africa have given Washington a reason to really guard its interests in that part of the world.
All right, Jessica, you spoke of type of resources and support Washington is putting behind the initiative. Can you go into detail as to what that is?
Well, this is, of course, an administration that has been known for cutting foreign aid, for withdrawing federal resources. So we didn't hear any big numbers or any numbers at all in terms of direct government lending. But what we did hear is they are trying to remove barriers to private lending and to private partnering. And one of those things that they have already achieved is they're streamlining some of the overseas lending institutions into one large institution that will have about $60 billion that it can lend to developing countries, many of whom are on the continent. And they also can do equity investments through this new organization. So that's a change. They intend to identify key partners on the continent, key countries to partner with, not just the major economies like Nigeria and Kenya, but some of the more emerging economies like Mozambique and maybe even Zimbabwe, to work with them to develop. But we really didn't get a large sense of what types of resources are going to be behind this in terms of dollar figures, more just the strategy of trying to engage further with the continent on an economic basis through trade, and of course that return to the familiar refrain that this president has: bilateral trade agreements, not multilateral institutions. But I think that the community that was here to listen to the speech from the continent really does have some skepticism as to what more strings might be attached to Washington's version of aid. For example, one person mentioned to me, are we going to have to renounce our interest in multilateral institutions in order to work with Washington under this presidency? So we'll have to see. That was certainly not a question asked or answered during this time, but a lot more to come from Washington when it comes to getting more specifics on this strategy. Richard?
All right.